And I will just say, the rumors are true. We have rewritten RAS. RAS 2025 is coming out by the end of the year. The question is, will it have non-Newtonian? Someone's got to pay for it. Non-Newtonian will be in 2025 within a year or two.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar covering Tailings Dam Failure Essentials. I'm your host, Craig Price with the International Water Training Institute. On behalf of the Australian Water School, we would like to acknowledge our global audience of almost 1,000 attendees with us today. Thank you so much for being with us today and for taking the time to join in what we hope will be an engaging discussion on this very important subject. Let's introduce our presenters and panelists. If you can all turn your cameras on, we've got a big panel with you today. So let's get to our meet and greet. So in the order that we see it here, we've got presenters from all around the world with us today. Stanford is a frequent flyer with the Australian Water School. He's provided some awesome sediment-related content for us in the past. And he runs one of the nerdiest podcasts that I know of. That might tell you a little bit about me, that I thoroughly enjoy that podcast. Stanford, any dreams of becoming a full-time podcaster when you retire?
No, sir.
All right, where are you coming to us from this morning?
All right, hi everyone. I'm Stanford Gibson. I am here from Davis, California. I'm one of the national sediment specialists for the Corps of Engineers and in charge of the sediment transport capabilities in HEC-RAS.
Perfect. Greg has likewise graced the Water School with some outstanding material on tons of previous webinars that we've held, and I've learned a tremendous amount from truly, he's an expert in the field of hydraulic modeling. How you doing today, Greg?
Thanks for that, Craig. I'm with TUFLOW, and I am one of the software engineers. I write the code that runs TUFLOW on the GPU, and you know, most of what we do is around water, but we also include the ability for non-Newtonian fluids as well. So, yeah, I'll contribute my 2 pennies worth today.
Excellent. Looking forward to that. Now, Jim is with Flow2D, and quite often you'll see Flow2D misspelled as FLOW. Now, as I understand, I think the FLO, if I understand this correctly, is Fullerton, Linzotti, and O'Brien. They actually stand for some names, all of whom were co-workers of mine way back in the day, including Jim. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Jim, and what you do to keep busy out in, I think are you in the Wild West of the U.S.? What state are you in?
I'm in Lake Placid, New York, home of the 1980 Winter Olympics, where the Americans beat the Russians. And I developed the Flow2D model.
Perfect. Well, we look forward to hearing more about that today. Francisco, this is Francisco's Australian Water School debut. So, Francisco, if you can let us know a little bit about maybe the software that you'll be covering for us today and what you do.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My presentation could be is the calibrate the rheology using the Flow3D in base the laboratory testing in small scales dam breaks.
Perfect. And then another debut today from Heather Thompson. Heather is joining us and participated in a recent ANCOLD forum on tailings dam breach modeling. She'll be addressing questions specific to the Australian guidelines in the background. I think Heather's just down the street here on the shores of the Indian Ocean in Perth. I guess it's bright and early for you, Heather. Good morning.
Yes.
If you can let us know who you work for.
Yes, I work for SIK Consulting. Yep, here in sunny Perth, Western Australia, where the sun's just coming up. I've been with SIK for 15 years as a tailings engineer now, and seen tailings dam breach assessments come from, you know, a factor of the height of the dam to where we are today.
Perfect. Well, looking forward to hearing from everybody today. Now, importantly, we're going to join you again in another hour. This is our first time trialing this sort of format. We've got a free webinar coming up now that we're going to all present in the order that you've seen here. But then in an hour, we're going to get into a premium webinar. In the past, we split these up. Today, we're going to do it one right after the other to see if it helps to have people's attention leading right from one into the other. But in order to join that second webinar, which is we want to be able to compensate the presenters, you'll need to go in through a payment portal here. And it's about, I think, $60 US nominal fee for this. But if you want to join us for that one, to keep things running smoothly, you can see a little animation on the screen of what you'll need to do. So while that's running in the background, thanks to those who filled out the poll results, Those poll results really were just two simple questions today. One was, have you modeled dam breach in the past, and have you modeled water storage dam breach? And have also, for those who might have modeled tailings in the past, we wanted to see how many are actually modelers. So let us know in the background if anybody has any trouble with the registration links while that's running in the background. So thanks for those poll results. It looks like we're split about 50-50 in terms of those attendees out of the roughly 1,000 who have registered here. We've got I think a statistically relevant segment here that have answered the poll, and about half of those have modeled water storage damage or dam failures, and only about a third have modeled tailings dam failures. So let's see if we can up that a little bit going forward. What I'm going to do now, as we prepare to dive into the presentations, I'll share some resources here with you that I've posted on a website called hydroschool.org/tailings. So you can see that up here. If you go to this website, you'll see some of the resources for today, including if you're watching this on a computer screen, you could even with your phone at the moment, so you don't lose the presentations in the background, use the QR code to register for part 2 so that you're ready to go. So this will be the recording. That's where we'll post the recording of today's session in the future, once it's posted about a day or two from now. And then this is the registration link that will still work for the second session, even once it's on YouTube. You'll hear about 4 software packages today. We've got TUFLOW, we've got Flow 2D, we've got HEC-RAS, and we've got Flow 3D. Now, these are not the only software packages we could have highlighted. If you use other software other than these 4, maybe just put in the chat line what software you use, because the more that we hear from people on different software, the more we'll know which content we ought to be able to bring forward. Now, we've got this database here that was comprised this is thousands and thousands of dam failures. Unfortunately, there are that many to compile, some of which are tailings dams. We've also got a database here compiled for you that has over 100 tailings dam failures that has some information on each one of these. So these are just some additional resources for you in the background that you can check out. If you wanted to model tailing or water storage dam breaches, we've got courses, we've got webinars on that. This is that webinar I was talking about that Heather participated in a few months ago. Do watch that, 90 minutes with these expert presenters. Very well worth your while to watch that. Some additional dam breach content that's for free for you through the Australian Water School. And specifically today, as we talk about non-Newtonian, there's some relevance to sediment transport modeling as well. And you may want to get into some of the free content that we've got on that. Now, as a preview, in the next 2 weeks, we're going to hear from some experts on climate change about how, at least in Australia, the climate change guidance is going to affect the predictions of probable maximum precipitation and the PMF as well. And so if you want to know how that affects things, especially for those who need to model dam breaches, whether it's tailings dams or water storage dams, that's going to have quite a significant effect on some of the analyses, particularly for mine closure. Some of the first principles that are highly relevant to highly dynamic situations like a dam breach, we've got covered for you here, in addition to some technical papers that cover all sorts of different subjects, including some calibration efforts and validation efforts against other software for particular dam breach events, and some ANCL papers specific to Australia, along with some benchmarking papers for other software, some of which I hadn't heard of before. But again, if you used any of these software packages, do have a look in the background or on the chat line and let us know what you've used. Now, as we get into the presentations here, I guess I did want to mention, not to kick off on a sour note, but this is serious business. And the better we can do at figuring out how to simulate the flow of tailings, the better we can design early warning systems and educate the public about the potential risks. I would encourage you to watch this documentary. You'll get to meet a woman named Paula. Now, she could have run for the hills when she heard a tailings dam that breached about 10 years ago. The mud flow was coming down toward a village. And instead of running for the hills, she rode on her motorcycle straight to where the mud flow was heading and tried to warn as many people as she could, and possibly saved hundreds of lives. Now, that was the only warning that the villagers got. And as we place more and more tailings in areas that are upstream of population centers and critical infrastructure, sensitive environments. We are dealing with a ticking time bomb. And when a mine closes and there's no more revenue being generated, who's going to make sure that these dams stay intact? That database that we saw that's got 100 tailings dam failure, unfortunately, is going to keep growing, and climate change is going to speed that up. So our goal today is to pass along some of the best practices for the industry that allow us to help simulate the consequences of a failure. And sometimes those results are going to be alarming, but sometimes that alarm is needed to put some of the measures into place that are going to keep populations and environments safe. This can save lives, but regardless of the economic status of the place where these dams are located, we need functional, effective early warning systems, and that's as much a fundamental, inalienable human right as the access to clean water. This is something that is discussed in a paper that accompanies this documentary here on the website. But our discussion today, my hope is that it can lead to a better understanding of the science that's needed to back up some of our modeling. So let's get to that science. Excited to hear about it. Let's hear from Greg first. If you can start sharing your screen, Greg, and let's hear a little bit about what we mean by non-Newtonian and viscosity and those sorts of terms. So over to you, Greg. I can see your screen just fine.
Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar. As I mentioned before, I'm Greg. I'm from TUFLOW. I'm just going to give a very, very quick presentation discussing the Herschel-Bulkley formulation. I mean, there are other formulations for non-Newtonian behavior, but this is a fairly universal one that most software packages attempt to implement. So the basic principle is that the shear stress within the fluid is equal to a yield stress plus a viscosity term times the rate of shear to the power of some exponent. If the fluid has an internal shear stress that is less than the yield stress, then it just deforms elastically, like a little bit of jelly or jello on a plate, and it won't actually flow. But once the shear stress exceeds the yield stress, then you'll begin to get shear strain rate, and it will flow. The important thing here is that there's a couple of important things. That exponent n is often also known as shear thinning or shear thickening. When n is 1, it's got a linear relationship between viscosity and shear strain rate. However, that will be offset by the yield stress. If the yield stress is also 0, and n is 1, then you've got a pure Newtonian fluid like, water or air or engine oil or honey, so that's pretty straightforward. When you do have a yield stress, then it starts to behave quite differently. And if n is not 1, then it can behave very weirdly with shear thinning and shear thickening. Now, I'll leave some of the others will explain more about that with the lab testing and some fantastic videos that you're going to see. So if you're going to set up a model, you need to know what numbers you're going to put in for the non-Newtonian material. One option is to use the rheology lab testing results, and we're going to have more on that today. The other option is just to say, well, I don't really know what's in my dam. What I'll do is I'll just take a couple of previous cases that might be related for some reason or another and find some parameters that work for that case. And then I'll reuse those parameters for a new model of my particular problem that I'm going to look at. So that's what I'm going to discuss now, is really how do you calibrate to a previous case? You're going to need a good digital elevation model of the extents around the dam and where the material got to. You're going to have a pretty good idea of the quantity of material that released and the way that the dam failed, whether it was instantaneous or whether it was an incremental slow failure. You're going to need to at least know what the final extents are of where the tailings got to at the end of the failure process. And that generally is going to be fairly well known from mapping that's done after the event. You might possibly also have some arrival times for when the flood wave got to particular locations, but you'd have to treat them with caution unless you really know for sure exactly how they were determined and whether or not they're accurate. So in terms of, okay, so I've got all of that. How on earth am I going to have an initial guess for some parameters to run my very first model? I would suggest starting very, very simply and just think thick molasses or yogurt or sour cream, there's nothing wrong with starting with a Newtonian viscosity of n equals 1, a linear viscosity of so that it's not shear thinning or shear thickening, and try a reasonably thick viscosity of something like 100 Pascal seconds. That's kind of like a cold molasses that's pretty thick and gooey. And then start adjusting, run a model with no shear stress to start, no yield stress to start with, and see what happens. And what you'll find is with no yield stress, the model will completely drain again afterwards. All of the material will disappear and go. So your final extents will go all the way downstream. They won't ever come to a stop. You're going to need to increase a yield stress if the material actually came to a stop somewhere. And then beyond that, you can try fine-tuning all of the parameters. But, you know, I would say that this picture conveys the image of something that's pretty thick and gooey, but in reality, it's a scale effect. You know, molasses on a spoon in the kitchen might look thick and gooey, but if you've got a tank of it that's 15 meters tall and that wall on the tank breaks, that molasses is coming for you just as fast as if it was water. So once you start thinking about huge valleyfuls of material, even a high viscosity is not high. It's still going to behave in quite a water-like fashion when it gets going, apart from that yield stress. So that's the really big one. Okay, yeah, thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Greg. If you want to see more of what's happening directly in TUFLOW, join us for that second session. Again, try and fill out the forms and use those QR codes or the other links that you've got available to you. Jim, if you can start sharing your screen, we'll get into that. And boy, that's interesting to hear about the molasses. There actually, if you Google it, Google the molasses floods, and there was actually a fatal flood of molasses. Scary as that might sound. So think about that a bit. Over to you, Jim.
Okay, thanks. We will discuss this from the standpoint of a little bit of history first. Flow2D was formulated in 1986 initially as MudFlow, and it was funded and developed by FEMA. It was the very first two-dimensional MudFlow model available. Our first training class was in 1997. And over the years, we've tried to expand this mud flow modeling and hyperconcentrated sediment flow modeling all the way to tailings dam breach tools and components. So initially, we were modeling tailings dam failure just as a hydrograph, as a mud flow hydrograph. We expanded the tailings dam breach option to include prescribed and actual breach erosion. Then we created a tailings dam tool because this is really critical. Most tailings dam have only a failure volume through the breach of about 30 to 40% of the total. So we need to estimate that. And we do track the sediment concentration by volume, spatially and temporally in every grid element we're modeling with. And then we've gone as far as being able to add hydrology, that is inflow maybe to a mud flow as it's moving downstream, or rainfall on the tailings dam itself and downstream channel inflow. Now we're allowing you to use a two-phase flow, so you can have water storage. We can do cascading dam failures and a dry stack collapse. When you model the tailings dam failure downstream, you can add all of the details that Flow2D offers in estimating the area of inundation, which is primarily controlled by the volume of the release. So we can do channels, we can add buildings, we can do hydraulic structures, storm drain modeling, street and gutter flow if your tailings is working its way through an urban area, berms and wall collapse, and finally, very important to the tailings dam modeling is the tailings dam failure itself and various forms of sediment transport modeling, which we do. Now, Flow2D is a physical process model, and the most important aspect of this is it reports on the volume conservation of both the fluid and the sediment. And we can model this with absolute zero error. That is less than 1/1,000,000th of 1% for the volume conservation. And if your model can't do that, you've got to seriously question what kind of results you're getting. It is a combined rainfall runoff model. There's no boundary condition or hot starts, and you can do variable time steps. Now, mud flows, all mud flows and all mud floods are very highly turbulent flows. The viscous stresses contribute to the total stress release, but it's the tailings dam turbulent and dispersive stresses that are estimated in Flow 2D that balance the losses with the viscous stresses. Now, if you're using the Bingham model to model your mud flow, all mud flows are turbulent and they're not laminar. So we discovered this back in the early days, 1986 and so forth. So we have a term for this, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. It is important, though, because these turbulent stresses contribute to a deviation from the Bingham flow, which is the excess. When you exceed the yield stress, you have to have a combined rate of change in your vertical velocity distribution that's highly turbulent. And so from a volume conservation perspective, this is from actual mud and debris flow events, you can come up with hyperconcentrated sediment flows that begin at 20 to 30% and go through mud flows 48 to 55%. And above that, we're not modeling fluids anymore. So what I encourage you to do if you're trying to calibrate, don't calibrate on just the basis of a laminar flow event. This is going to be the range of reasonable data for viscosity and a reasonable range of the yield stress as a function of concentration. And this is of the fluid matrix. So we're not including boulders, logs, cars, dead cows, whatever, in this. The boulders and the logs and so forth are just along for the ride. They're not available in sufficient volume to be able to come up with a laminar flow resistance in this case. So if you have this kind of data, which you can collect from viscometer or from laboratory data that's been generated by somebody else, you can create a reasonable range of this data to see where you fall. Now, the dispersive stress contribution to this has three conditions: high sediment concentration, large velocity gradients, and sediment particles that are on the order of at least 1% of the flow depth. This is the stress that is transferred as momentum to the boundary by the collision of billiard balls, essentially. That is the different sized particles in the sediment flow. And we created this. When I say we, Pierre, Julian, and I put this together, and it shows you that the relationship of the dispersive to the turbulent contribution is 1 at 53% concentration by volume. I allow you to see some other concentration by volumes that you might be familiar with. So we have this opportunity to run Feijão or Brumadinho for you here. So this is Feijão. And we were able to do this without calibration. We just use an appropriate set of viscosity and yield stress and let it run because the model takes care of the turbulence and the dispersive stresses for you.
Excellent. So what we can do then, Jim, what we'll do, we want to just remind everybody that there's a second session here where you'll get to see a little more detail on this one and get to learn a little bit more about Flow 2D and how it interacts with some of these rheological parameters. So what we'll do now is that's going to be discussed in part 2 of the webinar. So come back with us. Do join for that session. If we can get Francisco to share your screen, let's go ahead and hear a little bit about now going from 2D into 3D. And again, we just wanted to give you a little bit of a highlight in this first session of what's coming. So thanks for that, Jim. That's awesome content. We look forward to seeing more of that in the second session. So Francisco, I can see yours just fine now. Perfect.
That is a quick introduction about the presentation I presented in the session 2. Yes, that is a calibration model using the Flow 3D. Yeah, I would like to show one video. We developed one test in one box rheometer. We're using the cameras 3D for recording all this one. We have around 30 frames per second. And you can see that is the break with the gate got down. We have a different condition of the tilings preparation. Is a fresh tilings and consolidated tilings we put with a weight. We have many combination for estimate the different condition of the tiling in different levels of the TSF. No, and after this one, we use the videos for this one. I can show in the next slide for calibrate that or replicate in Flow 3D. The idea is we have exactly the same velocity, the same shape, the same depth in the same time. No, with this video, with the 3D cameras, we use a one coding with Python for generate all about that with the time, with the area, the width, the depth, the volume, the velocity, and the hydraulic radio, and with all this data in each step of time, we can go to the Flow 3D and try with different rheologies and different parameters for looking for what is the best rheology match with a real case in a small scale. No, when we have this one, after that we estimate with all the shapes in different time steps what is the rheology. No, is in this case we have for all these ones one shear rate and shear stress, and we use these parameters for the full scale modeling. That is important because when we use the rotary viscometer, we have many issues, mainly when is the consolidated tilings is too strong for the rotary viscometer, is too small. When it's coarse particular, it's not easy to get properly results. In this moment, we're thinking what is the best way to elaborate or create one extra test to complement the rotary viscometer, and that is our proposal. And we use that for many different dam breaks, and that is really good results in our point of view using the Flow 3D. The Flow 3D is a really strong software we use, however, have some limitation. No? One of them is having the infiltration. That must be really important, especially when you have the fresh tiling, because that is the one of the inputs or the way to the stop running the tilings. And the other one is the manning. They use the manning is very well. However, the manning for water or fluid have many studies for many years. However, for rheology is we found the manning is not exactly the same value we use for the typical water or other fluids, and that must be developed in different ways. In the case for regions, no, because when we modeling the full scale in Flow 3D, we have just one value for whole the topography, and that is not a real case in the real situation. No, the idea is put in regions, and we have used a beta model for for a properly flow slide. No, that is my first introduction. I can develop. I speak a little more in the second session. Thank you, Craig.
All right, sounds good. So hopefully you get a little bit of a preview of some of the ways of calibration, some of the things we can undertake. So Stanford, I can see your screen just fine. Let's hear a little bit about HEC-RAS now.
All right, well, thanks. What a great webinar. I've enjoyed being part of it. So I guess it's my turn to contribute. Most of you have heard of HEC-RAS, HEC-RAS as we like to call it, and we're kind of the new kid on the block with respect to non-Newtonian modeling. Mine tailing dam breaches is not really part of the Corps of Engineers core mission, although it is becoming more so as these structures age. We got into the non-Newtonian space because of post-wildfire, and mainly, we were involved with the Santa Barbara post-wildfire, and we went and tried to model this with RAS. And you can see that here are the boundaries of that event measured by the USGS, and here's what I like to call blue water answer that RAS gave, and it's just inappropriate. And so that's when we actually got the support we wanted to do it for years, but that's when we actually got the support to add non-Newtonian to RAS, and we were able to simulate this event much better. We developed, we have a paper out there on this event and Brumadinho, which were kind of our validation cases in the field. And so that's really where I got into mine tailing dam failure. And, you're all familiar with this event. We've been talking about this event. This is one of the tragic water resources events in our generation. And so, the Corps was actually on the ground very early. We have an office in Brasilia, and we had a representative there within a few days of this. And one of the authors on the paper is from the University of Brasilia, and so he was involved from about the first week. And so we ended up modeling this like many other people do. This turns out not to be a very difficult non-Newtonian model. We talk about in the paper how this is kind of a concave valley, which is a lot easier than a convex alluvial fan, which a lot of the post-wildfire debris flows are on. So we simulated the extent, and also our arrival times were within 2%. And of course, you can just change your parameters to hit that. Very impressive that Dr. O'Brien did not calibrate. A lot of that is the physics that his equation are doing. We used Bingham here. We actually did originally use Dr. O'Brien's equation, but what we wanted to do is we turned this, instead of a calibration, later on we turned this into what we call a validation. We wanted to just kind of make sure that RAS was doing this right. And so what we did is we took the parameters that were used in Lombroso's work. Lombroso used Mike 21. And so, we posited, hey, if RAS is structurally sound with respect to non-Newtonian, we should just be able to take the Lombroso parameters, put them in RAS, and get the result. And so they used these parameters, which we like a lot. These are very close to the parameters that we use for post-wildfire work, fluid viscosity of 100. You just heard Greg say, hey, think about starting with 100. That's also our guidance. Our guidance for post-wildfire is, viscosity is a real thing. And so you can estimate viscosity. We like to say, ketchup plus or minus mustard is kind of what you're thinking about for viscosity. And then yield stress is a little bit harder to get a hold of. And so we generally bound our yield stresses about 700 to 2,500 pascals. And so this was right within the range of what we usually do. So we just plugged those in. This is not a calibration, it's a validation. If we use the Mike 21 parameters, this is the result you get. And so we've talked about the simplest approach to these high concentration events, the Bingham approach. I'm kind of a fan. I like my complicated equations to have as few free parameters in them as possible. And this is the RAS interface, where you can choose your your method and the volumetric concentration, and then you define the yield strength and the viscosity. But you don't choose one yield strength or one viscosity. We like to say around here that you never give one answer in something uncertain as sediment transport or mud and debris flow. So we always we fix our better known parameter, our parameter with less uncertainty, and we vary our lesser known parameter, our parameter with more uncertainty. And so we tend to fix our viscosity because that's a thing in the world, a thing you can conceptualize, and then we vary or do sensitivity on our yield strength. And so this is an example of a debris flow that we actually predicted, and then it did happen, as opposed to a hindcasting. But we're running a little bit higher viscosity than we usually use here, but with a range of yield strengths. And you can kind of see how yield strength varies. But as we said, in the post-wildfire world, we're zeroing in on a range of yield strengths in the Western United States. Other places have wests that are between 700 and about 2,500. So you can see that that actually is a relatively constrained answer, particularly if you're using the model for emergency action and evacuation. Okay, but not all fluids have this nice, simple linear rheology. And so my favorite non-Newtonian fluid is frog spit. It turns out, you ever wonder why the insect sticks to the frog's tongue? That's because it's a non-Newtonian fluid, and as it increases the stress, the viscosity increases, and that's how the frog actually eats. And so there are lots of there are ways you can do nonlinear models, including Dr. O'Brien's equation. And the thing that's elegant about Dr. O'Brien's equation is, yeah, we have these same familiar terms of yield and viscosity, but then you have these other processes that are based on physical parameters, things, actual physical processes. And so this becomes a quadratic equation, and we use this whenever we feel like you need that quadratic term when you're shear thickening. And then we also have clastic grain flow equations. Now, these actually had a bug in them in 6.5. So if you've tried to use these in the past and been underwhelmed, you should have been. Wait for 6.6. These have been fixed. But also, we've found that, these clastic equations, that's for when you start to get close to a landslide, really high concentrations. But what we understand about mine tailing dam failures is that they behave more like mud flows, and so you're generally not in this space. And then finally, Greg talked about the Herschel-Bulkley equation, which when n goes to 1 just collapses to the Bingham equation. We've used this for laboratory stuff, but as I said, I like to have as few parameters as possible. So if I can have 2 instead of 3, I will. Now, sometimes some of the lab experiments show that some of those a lot of the mud flows are shear thinning. So I think as the information comes in, as we learn more about this, maybe we will get comfortable with parameterizing the n, but our agency isn't there yet. One of the things that that is interesting about RAS, and again, we're new to this space, so this is all kind of new, but we do have a very robust dam failure package in RAS. There are 3 different ways you can do dam failure analysis, including this kind of physical modeling approach developed by Dr. Wei-Ming Wu, who's at Clarkson, who was at Ole Miss, and that has this kind of physical head cutting approach to dam failure that I think could be really useful in the mine tailing dam failure analysis. And the question was asked, how do you do cascading dam failures? But we have the ability to actually look at how those dams would fail in order. Okay, but the biggest fixed bed liability of non-Newtonian RAS is we have a constant concentration. You have a constant concentration in time and a constant concentration in space. You get one concentration, that's it. And that's not fun. Lots of people, especially with these mine tailing dam failures, you want to be able to mix high concentration fluid with water, the stuff that, again, Dr. O'Brien was talking about in Flow 2D. And I will say you have a constant concentration in the fixed bed model. We haven't been publicizing this because we're still kind of thinking a lot about how sediment transport functions interact with non-Newtonian fluids, but we've done some work and you can run non-Newtonian in our sediment transport model, and then you can use the advection diffusion equation we use in our sediment transport model to advect and diffuse your non-Newtonian fluid and mix your concentration, and then your rheology will be based on that mixed concentration. That sounds like a lot of work. Do you really want to do a full 2D sediment transport model? Well, you can, and we're actually coming up with ways to simplify that. But we've added a number of simplified modules to our sediment transport module, including what we call a concentration only model. And what that does is that allows you to only use the advection diffusion equation with some simplified erosion deposition terms to route a sediment pulse or a mud and debris pulse with non-Newtonian parameters through your model. And so this is a classic case that we ran into, is that we had a big wildfire up in the Eagle Creek watershed, and the Eagle Creek flows right into Bonneville Dam, like one of the major core assets. Bonneville Dam, 1.3 giga, whatever. Like this is a major core asset. And so the question is, if we got a debris flow here, would it reach the dam? And a single concentration won't tell you that. And so we modeled this with concentration only to route the non-Newtonian pulse into the reservoir to see how far is it going to get. And so we're going to get the non-Newtonian pulse that comes down through here, and we can see kind of how far it gets and what's the likelihood that it will impact the dam. Okay, I do just have to say we did add a Bingham cooling model to non-Newtonian. You know, our friend Horn from Iceland was using it to model the Iceland volcano, and then she was burning it in for cooling and then running it again and again. And so we got like a week of funding to try this. Alex Sanchez developed this. He's brilliant, and so he actually added the COSIT cooling model with a heat balance. And so what you're seeing here is the temperature of the lava, and it essentially alters the Bingham parameters as it cools. This is one of the most interesting things we've worked on. It's also not within the core model and within the core mission space, and so we don't really have funding to work on it. So we have a little alpha tag there. All right, so that's what I got, but we have lots of resources online. We're trying to put as much as we can online. In particular, in anticipation of this session, I put up a lecture I gave, which is essentially a lit review of the post-wildfire non-Newtonian parameters. I'd love to do something very similar with the mine tailing dam rheological parameters. If you have papers that you want me to consider, please send them to me. We also have a YouTube site, and yes, I do have a river mechanics podcast that includes some non-Newtonian content. And I will just say, the rumors are true. We have rewritten RAS. RAS 2025 is coming out by the end of the year. The question is, will it have non-Newtonian? Someone's got to pay for it. But I do have a meeting on Thursday with an interested party who has the ability to give the federal government money. I think it will be in 2020. Non-Newtonian will be in 2025 within a year or two.
Wow. All right. Thanks so much. You know, maybe we need a whole session just on that, Stanford. So let's talk about how to get some more content here. Do fill out for all the attendees. Do fill out the registration link for part 2 if you want to join us for a little more detail. Stanford, one question for you before we break here. When you see, it looks like you were able to get HEC-RAS and Mike 21 to give the same answers. Now, when I've looked at all the different calibration studies for this Brumadinho failure in particular, I see wildly different parameters sometimes being used to get the same answer. Are you concerned on the state of the industry with software and hardware the way they are at the moment with the equations that are built in when different parameters are applied to get the same result? Is that something that concerns you?
Let me give you a couple answers to that. First, if you're using different parameters, you need to make sure you're using the same equation. Yield strength is not always yield strength, right? Yield strength in the yield strength in the Bingham equation is basically compensating for processes that the O'Brien equation that Flow 2D uses physics to compute. So I wouldn't expect those two yield strength to be the same in those two things, because essentially, we're sweeping a lot of processes under the yield strength rug in the Bing equation that Flow 2D accounts for in physics. And then I would also say that just even just having just a yield strength, an n value, and a viscosity, those three things covary. And so even in RAS, you could get you could calibrate with 3 different parameter sets. And so that's why whenever I calibrate, I say, what are my most certain parameters and least certain parameters? You fix your most certain parameters and you vary your least certain parameters. And then I think you just accept that you're going to build intuition about the parameters space that you want to apply in your model, and be careful about applying parameters between models.
Perfect. All right, you can see why Stanford is the Hans Albert Einstein Award winner. Go check out some of that. If you Google any of that, you'll see some of the contributions Stanford has made to this space. Hans Albert Einstein being the founder of the department that I was at Berkeley, and somebody very famous in the in sediment transport. So join us if you can. Fill out that link. We'll bring all of our presenters back on in the in our next session. For those watching the YouTube recording, we'll put a link to the second session registration in the description below. But what we want to make sure we give everybody sufficient time to log off of this one and register for the next one. Again, let us know what you want to see more of. Let us know if there is other content that you'd like to see. We look forward to joining with you and the other presenters shortly. You'll see that link there if you're able to just use your phone to scan that in, or use the registration links to join us for part 2. We'll hear from Greg and from Jim and from Francisco a bit more detail about each of those software packages and some of the considerations. If you want to do this yourself and have a go at running a model yourself, we're going to provide you all of the resources through this LMS system that you've seen a demo of here in the background, that will allow us to post some specific information, tutorials and guidance that will walk you through trying this yourself in whichever model you would like to apply. So thanks so much to our presenters today. I recognize that might have been a bit of a whirlwind in terms of this introduction. We wanted to give you a taste of what's coming and give you the resources that you need if you want to try this yourself, again, so we can make the world a safer place. As tailings get stacked up upstream of population centers, we need to make sure that we're able to predict where they're going to go and how they're going to end. If you're doing water modeling, it might be disconcerting to see a slope come out and have it just end with a slope. In water modeling, you never have it end. If you've ended with a slope, you haven't run your model long enough. It's going to keep going. And so seeing things stop at an angle, it's a little disconcerting as a hydraulic modeler to see what happens with these non-Newtonian models. And so there are some complexities here we want to make sure you're aware of. Join us for that second part, and we'll hear a little more about that. We'll see you again next time with the Australian Water School. Thank you.